What if I told you we have better evidence for Christianity than what's in the Bible? This might sound weird, but I'm not talking about some abstract philosophical argument. I mean a real event backed by photographs, millions of eyewitnesses, and even a government investigation. It happened in Zeitoun, Egypt, and yet many Christians, especially Protestants, completely dismiss it. Take Jonathan McClatchy, for example. He argues that miracles like Zeitoun don't even come close to the resurrection because, according to him, we don't see Mary talking, eating, or physically interacting with people the way that Jesus did after he rose from the dead. Now, at first, this might actually seem pretty reasonable, but what if I told you that his standard actually backfires and makes Zeitoun look even stronger? By the end of this video, you'll see why Christianity's best evidence might not be in ancient manuscripts. It might be in something far closer and far more undeniable. Let's dive in. So recently, my Protestant friend Jonathan McClatchy posted this on Facebook. I've seen several people in recent days, for example, Cameron Bertuzzi, Sam Shamoon, claim that alleged apparitions of Mary are comparably supported to the resurrection of Jesus, and that Protestants are being inconsistent to reject the former while affirming the latter. There really is no serious comparison. When you find an example of Mary participating in group conversations, engaging in extended discourses, inviting physical contact, cooking breakfast for groups of people, eating and drinking with groups, and being passed objects like the broiled fish handed to Jesus in Luke 24:42, get back to me. So according to Jonathan, unless Mary is out here like hosting brunch, maybe handing out some homemade falafel and having deep theological discussions over coffee, we can't even compare Zeitoun to the resurrection evidence. Why is that? Well, because Jesus ate, drank, talked for long periods, and physically interacted with people. That, he claims, makes the resurrection way better evidenced than Zeitoun. Now, let's be fair though, this does sound like a reasonable argument at first, at least at first. If you're comparing miracles, it makes sense to ask which one has more sensory evidence, more ways people could experience it firsthand. But the question is, does Jonathan's standard actually hold up? So let's put it to the test. And remember, by the end of this, you'll actually see why the Bible, great as it is not our best evidence for the truth of Christianity. All right, so if Jonathan's argument is right, the resurrection should have clear and overwhelming evidential superiority over Zeitoun. First, what do we have for Zeitoun? Well, we have thousands of firsthand eyewitnesses, including Muslims, skeptics, journalists, and even government officials. We also have photographs, something we don't have for the resurrection. We have immediate written reports, no decades-long gap. We have public and repeatable events. The apparitions occurred countless times, spanning 3 years to massive crowds. We have multiple sensory experiences. People didn't just see it, they also smelled incense and documented miraculous healings. We also had a government investigation, and it didn't debunk it. In fact, the secular Egyptian government officially declared it supernatural. This is very serious evidence. And if you're thinking like, wait, this actually does kind of sound stronger than our evidence for biblical miracles, you would be right. Now, compare the evidence at Zeitoun for what we have for the resurrection. We do have eyewitness testimony, but from a small number of people. We have some hearsay accounts written 2 or so decades or thereabouts after the event. We have no photographs. The camera wasn't even invented yet. And we also don't have secular confirmation. So for example, we have no formal contemporaneous, say, Roman investigation concluding that anything mysterious or supernatural happened like we do in Zeitoun. But things get much, much more difficult for Jonathan. He is a maximalist. So he thinks the New Testament is generally reliable and that we can therefore use it to establish facts that most historians would actually reject. That means that before he can even argue for the resurrection, he first has to defend the historical reliability of the Gospels. That means proving traditional gospel authorship, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote the accounts attributed to them. Early dating, that the Gospels were written early enough to reflect firsthand testimony. Textual transmission, that the Gospels were preserved without corruption. Legendary development, that later Christians didn't exaggerate the story. undesigned coincidences that the details confirm historical reliability, and then 6 supposed contradictions. He has to also show that the alleged inconsistencies in the gospel don't undermine credibility. If you can see the point here, this is a huge burden on anyone who wants to argue for the resurrection. If any single one of these elements is undermined, the case for the resurrection is weakened. Now, to be sure, I ultimately agree with Jonathan about this. After the hard work, the case for the resurrection is very strong. But the point is, unlike the resurrection, Zeitoun doesn't require defending ancient documents. It has direct contemporaneous evidence. There's no need to reconstruct history. The events were public, repeatable, and reported in real time. There's no need to debate textual reliability because the evidence isn't tied to disputed ancient manuscripts. There's no need to argue over legendary development because we don't have to wait decades for the first reports. The eyewitnesses are still alive, meaning that we can verify their accounts firsthand even today. And it was also confirmed by non-Christian sources, including journalists and the Egyptian secular authorities. So here is the point. Even if we grant that Jesus eating and talking would be stronger evidence than an apparition like what happened at Zeitoun, which we're going to talk about in a second, the problem is that our evidence for those events is far weaker than our evidence for Zeitoun. To believe that Jesus ate and spoke, we rely on a handful of relatively late sources, some of which are secondhand reports. But with Zeitoun, we have thousands and thousands of eyewitnesses, including both Christians and non-Christians, who saw the apparition in real time. So even by Jonathan's own maximalist evidential standard, the documentation for Zeitoun is stronger. Now, at this point, Jonathan might still want to push back. He might say something like, yeah, but Zeitoun doesn't have Mary eating fish. It doesn't have Mary touching people or speaking in long discourses. But now we need to ask, why should that be the standard? Jonathan is assuming that physical interaction equals stronger evidence. But is that actually true? So Jonathan's argument is that the resurrection had more sensory interactions, and he believes that this makes it harder to explain away naturally. And he's actually right about this. The more senses an event engages, the harder it is to dismiss as a hallucination or some kind of psychological trick. So for example, if Jesus only appeared to people in a vague, shadowy form, skeptics could claim that it was just a grief-induced vision. But that is not what the gospel accounts describe. Instead, Jesus spoke in long conversations. He touched his disciples and invited them to feel his wounds. He ate and drank in front of people. He passed objects back and forth like the broiled fish in Luke 24:42. Now, obviously, we need to keep in mind that the evidence for those claims in the Gospels isn't as strong as the evidence that we have for Zeitoun. But if all of that actually happened, the apostles did have multi-sensory experiences, which helps rule out hallucinations, dreams, or subjective visions. So something real must have actually been there. And Jonathan is arguing that because the resurrection included these kinds of interactions, it has a stronger evidential basis than what we see at Zeitoun. And again, the reason for this is because it helps to rule out alternative explanations. But the problem is that facts about Zeitoun also rule out natural explanations just as effectively, if not more so. Zeitoun was not some sort of vague vision. It wasn't a subjective experience that only a few people had. It was a public, repeatable event over years that engaged multiple senses. Sight. People saw a luminous figure of Mary, sometimes moving and responding to the crowd. They also saw doves flying around against the wind in different formations. They also saw strange glowing red smoke surrounding the church. Sound. The apparition responded to audible cries and shouts from the crowd, shifting position or moving when addressed. Smell. Many witnesses actually reported the overwhelming scent of incense filling the air when the clouds of smoke were present. So Zeitoun was not some sort of visual phenomenon. It engaged sight, sound, and smell, just like the resurrection appearances did. And just like with the resurrection, these multisensory elements make alternative natural explanations incredibly weak. And at this point, honestly, Jonathan's entire argument collapses. He claims that multisensory interactions make the resurrection stronger because these interactions rule out alternative explanations. But Zeitoun has the same feature, in some ways even stronger. We have far more witnesses, millions, not just small groups. It was public and repeatable, not a private event that happened only a handful of times to a handful of people. It was confirmed by skeptics, non-Christians, and a secular government investigation. Moreover, just like the resurrection, Zeitoun defies all natural explanations. Could it have been mass hallucination, for example? Actually, that's impossible. You don't get millions of people across multiple nights over years hallucinating the same exact thing. It doesn't happen. Complete with moving figures, flying doves, and interacting responses. What about tectonic strain theory? Some skeptics claim that natural light phenomenon can actually result from seismic activity. But the neuroscientific literature has thoroughly debunked Persinger's claim about electromagnetic fields inducing hallucinatory religious experiences. What about a technological hoax? Well, this was 1968. No known projector at the time could display a floating, moving three-dimensional figure in open air on multiple nights, and the hostile secular authorities literally shut off the electricity around the church. So if Jonathan wants to say that ruling out natural explanations is a strength of a theory, then he has no reason to dismiss Zeitoun while accepting the resurrection. At this point, Protestants are running out of options. They have no natural explanation for what happened at Zeitoun. Zeitoun checks every box they claim makes the resurrection so strong. And that's when at least some of them pull out their absolute worst argument yet. Okay, maybe Zeitoun wasn't a hallucination or a hoax, but what if it was demonic? All right, let's talk about that. So at this point, skeptics are pretty much running out of options. Zeitoun has millions of witnesses, photographic evidence, immediate documentation, multiple sensory experiences, and even a secular government investigation confirming it as supernatural. It rules out natural explanations just as well, if not better, than the resurrection. So what's left? Well, in comes the demonic hypothesis. The apparition was actually a demon. This is when you know they have not a lot left. So for starters, this hypothesis faces actually an insurmountable issue. This exact move was actually used against Jesus himself. In Matthew 12:24, the Pharisees saw Jesus performing miracles and accused him of doing them by the power of Satan. It is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this man drives out demons. Do you notice the similarity here? But notice, what was Jesus's response? Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined. If Satan drives out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then can his kingdom stand? In other words, Satan doesn't perform miracles that destroy his own work. And yet that's exactly what at least some Protestants are claiming when they dismiss Zeitoun as demonic. Would Satan really perform a miracle that leads Muslims to Christ, strengthens Christian devotion, confirms Christian beliefs about Mary, and most importantly, confirms the resurrection if Mary is alive and blessed? Surely her son is also. That's not demonic deception. That is Satan just like sabotaging himself. The actual fruit of the Zeitoun apparitions completely contradicts what we expect from a demonic deception. Conversions and spiritual renewal. Zeitoun led to mass conversions, especially among Muslims. People deepened their prayer lives, returned to faith, and experienced miraculous healings. We'll discuss more of those miracles in future videos, actually. And also, no false teachings. Unlike controversial Marian apparitions that skeptics might point to, Zeitoun never gave a heretical message. There were no private revelations, no calls to venerate anything new, just a public, undeniable miracle. It was also endorsed by the church. The Coptic Orthodox Church and Catholic Church both confirmed that this apparition aligned with Christian faith and bore good fruit. So let's be real about this. If Satan was actually behind this, he did a terrible job. But here's where it gets worse. If Protestants claim that Zeitoun was demonic, why couldn't non-Christians say the same about Jesus? If Protestants get to argue, Zeitoun was supernatural, but I don't really like where it leads, so I'm just going to say that it's demonic. What stops a non-Christian from saying the resurrection was definitely supernatural, but I don't like where it leads, so I'm also going to say that that's demonic too? This is intellectual suicide. It's handing skeptics the exact weapon they need to reject Christianity. But some people still try one more way out. Well, at least we know that it was Jesus in the resurrection, but we don't really know if Zeitoun was actually Mary, right? All right, let's talk about this one. So at this point, the Protestant objections are crumbling. They tried to argue that the resurrection had better evidence, but we've seen that Zeitoun actually meets or exceeds it in multiple ways. They seem to think that Zeitoun had more alternative explanations, but actually every natural explanation fails. They even pulled out the demonic hypothesis, but that just backfired since Jesus himself refuted that kind of reasoning in Matthew 12. So now some Protestants take one last swing. Okay, but at least we know that the disciples saw Jesus. How do we know that Zeitoun was actually Mary? Just like with some of the other objections, this does kind of sound reasonable at first, but let's think about this clearly. First, if Protestants want to claim that certainty about identity is what makes a miracle more credible, they've got a very serious problem. Because even in the resurrection appearances, people didn't always recognize Jesus immediately. Consider Mary Magdalene mistook Jesus for a gardener in John 20:14 through 15. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walked with him for miles without realizing it in Luke 24:15 through 16. And even some disciples at the Great Commission doubted it was him, Matthew 28:17. So if immediate recognition is the standard, then the resurrection appearances themselves would be questionable. So clearly, Protestants like Jonathan don't actually hold this standard when it comes to Jesus. But now let's apply this to Zeitoun. So what are the realistic options for what people saw? Well, one, maybe it was a supernatural manifestation of Mary. Number two, it was a supernatural manifestation of someone else, but then who? And then three, it was a natural event misinterpreted by millions of people. We've already ruled out option three. There is no natural explanation that accounts for Zeitoun. So if it was supernatural, then we're left with the question, who was it? So let's think this through. The figure appeared over a church literally dedicated to Mary. The figure looks exactly like traditional depictions of Mary, and Muslim witnesses even said the figure looked like a nun. The figure acted in ways associated with Mary, raising her hands in blessing and responding to the crowd. And the figure led people, especially Muslims, to Christ. Oh, and another one is that she was seen actually holding the Christ child. If this wasn't Mary, then what was it? Who was it? A random angel like cosplaying as her? Was it maybe Joan of the Arc, maybe borrowing her appearance? If it wasn't Mary, why would whoever it was let people make that inference? This objection reeks of desperation. If a luminous figure that looks, acts, and appears in a place associated with Mary isn't Mary, then what could possibly count as Mary appearing? At this stage, Protestants are really running out of arguments, but there's still one last thing they might cling to. Well, at least the disciples were willing to die for their belief in the resurrection, right? That shows how strong their conviction was. Okay, so let's go there now. So earlier, we saw that Protestants like to argue that the multisensory nature of Jesus's appearances strengthens the case for the resurrection. Their reasoning was basically that the more physical interactions Jesus had, eating, speaking, and touching, the harder it is to dismiss the appearances as hallucinations. Now they're making a very similar move with martyrdom. Since the disciples were willing to die for their testimony, we can rule out the idea that they were lying about what they saw. And since they weren't lying, that actually strengthens the case that the resurrection really happened. So the logic here is actually the same. Just as multisensory evidence helps rule out certain hypotheses like hallucination, martyrdom helps rule out conspiracy. But here's the issue with this. If that is the standard, Zeitoun also passes the test. Zeitoun witnesses weren't just believing in an apparition, they directly saw it with their own eyes. This wasn't religious devotion, it was public, repeatable, first-hand experience shared by thousands. So if sincerity helps rule out conspiracy, then the Zeitoun witnesses were just as sincere as the disciples. Now, thankfully, our Coptic brothers and sisters who witnessed Zeitoun haven't been put in a position where they had to die for their testimony. Also, keep in mind that many Muslims saw the apparition as well, so it wouldn't make a ton of sense for them to start persecuting Christians for that belief. But if they were persecuted, does anyone seriously doubt that they would be willing to die for their belief? Would a devout Coptic Christian who saw the luminous figure of Mary with their own eyes deny it under persecution? Their willingness to suffer, which I think is a reasonable inference, would prove sincerity just like the resurrection witnesses. So again, Protestants are applying a double standard here. They said multisensory experiences make the resurrection stronger, but Zeitoun had those too. They said natural explanations must be ruled out, but Zeitoun rules them out just as effectively. They said the disciples' willingness to die makes the resurrection stronger, but Zeitoun's witnesses were just as sincere. And when they ran out of objections, they pulled out the demonic hypothesis, which completely imploded when compared to Jesus' own words in Matthew 12. So at this point, we need to be honest. Like, this isn't just about evidence anymore, because if Zeitoun really happened, it doesn't just challenge Protestant assumptions, it confirms Christianity in a way that is impossible to ignore. First, if Mary is alive, so is Jesus. If Mary appeared, then she's in heaven, just as Christianity teaches. And if she's alive, her son who conquered death must be as well. Second, she appeared at a Christian church. The apparition took place at a site proclaiming Christ's divinity and resurrection, reinforcing Christianity, not another faith. And then third, the miracles pointed to Christ. The healings and wonders tied to Zeitoun happened in a Christian context, lending divine credibility to the faith that honors Mary and worships her son. But I want to make it clear, this isn't just about Protestants. It's about how we think about Christian evidence as a whole. Like, if we had this level of proof, photographs, mass eyewitness testimony within days of the events, secular investigations for any other supernatural claim, it would be front page news in Apologetics. Imagine if we had photographs of the empty tomb glowing with light. Imagine if millions of people, including skeptics, saw and confirmed it. Would anyone seriously doubt the resurrection if we had that level of evidence? But that's exactly what Zeitoun is. It's a miracle caught in real time, confirmed by believers and non-believers alike. And yet, many Christians ignore it. So at this point, the choice is very clear. Either we follow the evidence where it leads, or we only accept miracles that fit our pre-existing theology. But here's what's at stake with all of this. If Zeitoun happened, and the evidence says it did, then Christianity isn't just a 2,000-year-old belief system. It's a living reality, proven in our own time. So the real question is this: are you following the evidence, or are you ignoring it because you don't like where it leads? Oh, and then one last thing.